The night of June 5th, 1944, belonged to chaos. Over Normandy, the sky filled with transport aircraft, C-47s in tight formation, their bellies heavy with paratroopers who would never touch the ground where they were supposed to. The official records state that approximately 15,000 American airborne troops jumped into the dark that night as part of Operation Overlord. The records also acknowledge that many Sticks, 12-man parachute teams, were scattered across 50 square miles of French countryside, some landing in flooded marshlands, others tangled in trees or impaled on German stakes hidden in the fields. What the records do not mention, because they cannot, are the men who vanished entirely. Not captured, not killed in action with witnesses to confirm it. Simply gone. This is the account of one such group. 12 men. Stick number 17 from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. They left England. They never arrived at their designated drop zone. Their fate remained unknown until a French farmer, clearing a collapsed root cellar in 1946, discovered a cache of personal effects, a broken SCR, 536 handy-talkie radio, and a field notebook containing entries that would take military investigators months to piece together and authenticate. The notebook was water-damaged, many pages illegible, but what remained painted a portrait of men who fell through the cracks of history. Not because they failed, but because the machinery of war lost track of them entirely. The drop. At 0117 hours on June 6th, the lead aircraft carrying Stick 17 encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire over the Cotentin Peninsula. Tracer rounds carved bright scars through the darkness. The pilot, a 23-year-old from Nebraska named Lieutenant Donald Kress, took evasive action, a sharp bank to starboard that sent the paratroopers stumbling against their static lines. The green jump light never came on. Instead, the crew chief, shouting over the roar of engines and flak bursts, kicked the door open and screamed for them to go. They went. 12 men spilled into the void at approximately 400 feet, while below the standard jump altitude, over terrain they would later realize was nearly 18 miles southeast of their intended landing zone near St. Miragelis. The sensation of falling through clouds is disorienting even in daylight. At night, over enemy territory, with anti-aircraft fire turning the sky into a lethal light show, it becomes existential terror wrapped in military discipline. The men of Stick 17 fell through rain and darkness, their T-5 parachutes snapping open with violent jerks that felt like salvation and damnation at once. Below them, the Normandy countryside stretched black and unknowable. No Pathfinder lights, no radio beacons, just fields and hedgerows and the distant rumble of artillery that sounded like a god clearing its throat. Staff Sergeant William Harkness hit the ground first, landing hard in a drainage ditch half filled with cold water. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He lay there for 30 seconds, listening. Listening was the first survival skill they drilled into him at Fort Benning. Listen before you move. The night carried sounds, distant explosions, the drone of aircraft still passing overhead, the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal from somewhere nearby. No voices, no challenge and password exchanges. He pulled himself from the ditch, water streaming from his jumpsuit, and began the process of accounting for his equipment. His M1 Garand had stayed strapped to his leg. His musette bag was intact. The brass cricket clicker issued to all paratroopers for identification was still in his pocket. He clicked it twice. The answering click came from his left, perhaps 20 yards away. Over the next hour, the stick assembled itself through a combination of cricket clicks, low whistles, and sheer luck. 9 men. 3 were missing. Private First Class Eugene Dalton, Corporal James Rourke, and Private Theodore Banks. Whether they'd landed farther away, been injured, or killed in the drop was unknown. Harkness made the calculation that every airborne NCO made that night. Search or move. The mission briefing had been clear: assemble, move to the objective, secure the crossing. But which crossing? They had no idea where they were. The terrain told them nothing helpful. Normandy was a patchwork of small fields bordered by hedgerows, ancient earthen walls overgrown with thick vegetation that turned every field into a natural fortification. The Norman Bocage, as the locals called it. To the paratroopers, it was a maze. Every hedgerow looked identical. Every field could hide a German machine gun nest. Maps were useless without reference points. And in the darkness, reference points did not exist. Private Leonard Marsh, the youngest of the group at 19, suggested they fire a flare to signal their position. Harkness stared at him for 3 full seconds before explaining, with the patience of a man addressing a child, that firing a flare would announce their presence to every German patrol within miles. They would navigate by dead reckoning and hope. The first hours, by 0300 hours, the stick had moved perhaps half a mile northwest, following a dirt road that seemed to lead toward higher ground. The rain had stopped, but fog settled into the low places, thick and white, turning visibility to mere yards. They moved in single file, weapons at the ready, every man's nerves stretched piano wire tight. The sounds of battle were everywhere and nowhere. Flashes on the horizon, the thump of explosions that could have been miles away or just beyond the next hedgerow. Distance was impossible to judge. They found a first body at the intersection of 2 cart paths. An American paratrooper, his chute still tangled in the branches of a gnarled apple tree. He hung there, neck bent at an angle incompatible with life, his rifle dangling from its strap. No dog tags they could see. His unit patch was from the 101st. Harkness ordered 2 men to climb up and cut him down, but the tree was too unstable. The branches rotted. They left him there. It felt like betrayal, but the war did not pause for proper burials. A mile farther on, they encountered what they first thought was an abandoned farmhouse. The structure was intact, but dark, its windows like empty eye sockets. Harkness sent Corporal Vincent Caruso and Private Raymond Kowalski to scout it. They returned 10 minutes later with news that made the situation clear. The farmhouse was occupied. German soldiers, at least 6, possibly more, sleeping in the main room. Equipment stacked by the door. A Kubel wagon parked in the barn. The standing orders were to avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. The mission was not to fight every German between the drop zone and the objective. It was to reach the objective. But here was a problem. They needed information. They needed to know where they were. And the Germans had maps. Harkness made the decision. They would hit the farmhouse at dawn. The farmhouse. Dawn in Normandy, June 6th, 1944, arrived as a gray smear across the eastern sky. The fog thickened rather than lifted, which worked in favor of the Americans. Harkness positioned his men in a loose perimeter around the farmhouse, 2 covering the front door, 2 at the back, the rest spread to cut off retreat. The plan was simple and brutal. Grenade through the window, rush the door, kill everyone inside before they could organize a defense. Simplicity was the soul of small unit tactics. At 0527 hours, Private Marsh pulled the pin on a Mark II fragmentation grenade and hurled it through the ground floor window. The explosion was muffled by the stone walls, but loud enough to wake the dead. Glass shattered. Smoke billowed. The paratroopers were moving before the echo faded. Caruso kicked in the front door. It splintered off its hinges, and the Americans poured into the farmhouse with the kind of violence that surprised even themselves. The Germans never had a chance. Some were still trying to untangle themselves from their bedrolls when the gunfire started. The close quarters battle lasted perhaps 20 seconds. A Thompson submachine gun chattered. Screams were cut short. When the smoke cleared, 6 German soldiers lay dead or dying. One, a young private with blood spreading across his tunic, tried to raise his hands and surrender. Harkness shot him twice in the chest. There were no prisoners to be taken. They had no way to guard prisoners, no way to transport them, and no illusions about mercy in this particular slice of hell. The intelligence haul was better than expected. Maps, a codebook, a field telephone still connected to a line that ran east. And most importantly, a marked map showing German positions in the area. Harkness spread it across a wooden table and studied it by the light of a single candle. What he saw made his stomach turn. They were not 18 miles off course. They were 23 miles southeast of St. Miraglise, deep in territory held by elements of the 91st Luftland Division. The map showed defensive positions, patrol routes, and a notation that sent ice through his veins. Amerikanische Fallschirmjäger in Sector 7 Gemeldet. American paratroopers reported in Sector 7. The Germans knew they were here. They were hunting them. Harkness gathered his men and explained the situation in the blunt language of a career NCO. They were behind enemy lines. Their unit had no idea where they were. The Germans were actively searching for scattered paratrooper groups to eliminate them before they could consolidate. Their options were limited. Try to make it back to Allied lines, approximately 20 miles northwest through occupied territory, or find a place to hide and wait for the invasion force to reach them. Neither option was good. Private Kowalski, a stocky kid from Pittsburgh with a reputation for dark humor, suggested a third option: surrender. Harkness didn't even dignify it with a response. They would move northwest. They would avoid contact where possible. They would survive. Radio silence. The SCR 536 handy-talkie radio they carried was a temperamental piece of equipment under the best circumstances. Effective range was 1 mile, maybe 2 with favorable conditions. The frequency was preset to the regiment's command net, but as Private First Class Douglas Brennan, their radio man, discovered, the command net was either out of range or no longer operational. He spent an hour trying to raise anyone, division, regiment, another stick, even a Navy ship offshore. Nothing. The radio crackled with static and the occasional burst of German communications, but no American voices responded to his calls. The silence was more demoralizing than the combat. In modern warfare, communication is the lifeline. Without it, a unit ceases to exist in any meaningful sense to the larger command structure. Stick 17 had become ghosts, present in the physical world, but absent from the operational map. No one was coordinating their movements. No one was sending relief. No one even knew to look for them in this sector. Brennan suggested they try the German telephone line they'd found in the farmhouse. It was insane and desperate, but desperation had become their constant companion. The idea was shot down immediately. Even if they could figure out how to use it without alerting the German switchboard operators, they had no way to reach Allied forces through enemy infrastructure. They destroyed the radio. Harkness made the call after consulting with Caruso, his most trusted man. The radio's weight was slowing them down, and its uselessness made it dead weight. More importantly, if they were captured, the radio would identify them as a formed unit rather than scattered stragglers. The distinction might mean the difference between a POW camp and a roadside execution. They smashed it with a rifle, butt, and buried the pieces in a hedgerow. From that moment forward, Stick 17 operated in complete isolation. They were 12 men against an army, with no support, no resupply, and no hope of reinforcement. The psychological weight of that realization settled over them like a burial shroud. The Hedgerow War. Movement through the bocage was an education in frustration and fear. Each hedgerow was between 6 and 12 feet tall, a wall of earth and roots and thorny vegetation that blocked sight lines and forced the squad to navigate field by field. The Germans, veterans of years of war, had turned this terrain into a defensive masterwork. Every gap in a hedgerow could be a kill zone. Every tree line might hide a sniper. Every sound, a bird taking flight, a twig snapping, could herald an ambush. On June 7th, 30 hours after the drop, Stick 17 had covered less than 8 miles. They were exhausted, filthy, and running low on ammunition. They'd encountered 2 more German patrols, avoiding one by hiding in a drainage culvert for 3 hours while enemy soldiers walked past close enough to touch, and engaging the other in a brief, vicious firefight that left 2 Germans dead and Private Marsh with a bullet graze across his ribs. The injured became a problem. Marsh could walk, but he needed the wound cleaned and dressed properly. They had sulfa powder and bandages, but no morphine. Harkness had used their entire supply on a critically wounded trooper they'd found dying in a field the previous day. The man had been gut-shot, intestines visible through a tear in his uniform. They'd given him morphine, made him as comfortable as possible, and moved on. There was nothing else to be done. That night, they took shelter in the ruins of a stone church on the outskirts of a village the map identified as Montmartin-en-Grains. The village was mostly intact, but abandoned. Its inhabitants fled or hiding. The church had taken artillery fire at some point. The roof was partially collapsed, and the western wall showed a gaping hole from a direct hit. But the crypt beneath was dry and defensible. In the crypt, by the light of shielded flashlight, Harkness held a council. The men sat in a circle, their faces gaunt and smeared with mud and cordite. The question was simple: keep moving or dig in? Corporal Caruso argued for movement. Every hour they stayed in one place was an hour the Germans had to find them. The invasion was happening. The Allies were pushing inland. If they kept moving northwest, eventually they'd reach friendly forces. Private First Class Thomas Nguyen, a quiet demolitions expert who rarely spoke, pointed out the counterargument. They were in no condition for a sustained march. They needed rest. They needed to treat marshes wound properly. And most critically, they needed intelligence. Stumbling through the countryside blind was as likely to get them killed as staying put. Harkness made the decision. They would rest here for 12 hours, conduct reconnaissance of the village, and see if they could gather information from any remaining civilians. Then they would move. The villagers. Montmartin Grange was not as abandoned as it first appeared. At dawn on June 8th, as Harkness and Caruso conducted a careful patrol of the main street, they saw movement in one of the houses, a curtain twitching, a face quickly withdrawn. Civilians. The question was whether they could be trusted. The history of the French resistance is well documented. Less well known are the thousands of ordinary French citizens who simply wanted to survive the occupation without getting involved in the war. Some were brave, some were collaborators. Most were somewhere in between, trying to protect their families in impossible circumstances. Harkness knew this. He also knew they had no choice but to make contact. They approached the house, a two-story farmhouse with a red tile roof, and knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing. Then the door opened a crack, and an elderly man peered out, his face carved with lines of worry and suspicion. Harkness tried his broken French, a handful of phrases learned for a quick reference card. Américain. Soldat. Nous avons besoin d'aide. The old man studied them for what felt like an eternity. Then he nodded and opened the door wider. His name was Henri Dubois. He was 71 years old. He had lived in this village his entire life, survived the First War, and watched the Germans occupy his country in 1940. He was not a member of the resistance, but he was no friend of the Germans either. He would help them if he could. Through a combination of gestures and simple French, Dubois explained the situation. The Germans had been in the area heavily until 2 days ago, when they'd suddenly redeployed north toward the invasion beaches. A squad had remained behind to patrol the area and watch for Allied airborne troops. Dubois had seen them just yesterday, checking houses and questioning anyone they found. The Germans knew American paratroopers were scattered throughout the countryside. They were conducting sweeps, methodically clearing each sector. Harkness asked about German strength. Dubois didn't know exact numbers, but he'd seen convoys moving through, trucks, armored cars, a few tanks. Not enough to stop an invasion, but more than enough to wipe out a single squad of paratroopers. The old man also provided something invaluable: bread, cheese, and water. Real food, not the K rations they'd been subsisting on. The men ate carefully, knowing that gorging on food after days of near starvation would make them sick. Dubois also had information about the surrounding area, which roads were patrolled, which paths were safe, where the Germans had set up checkpoints. Before they left, Harkness asked Dubois one more question. Had he seen other American paratroopers? The old man nodded sadly. 3 days ago, he'd found 2 of them in a field, both dead from gunshot wounds. He'd buried them behind his barn. Harkness asked if he could see the graves. Dubois led him to 2 mounds of freshly turned earth. No markers, no dog tags recovered. Just 2 more ghosts added to the tally. The notebook. The field notebook recovered from the root cellar in 1946 contained entries written in Harkness's cramped handwriting. The early entries were routine: roster checks, ammunition counts, movement plans. But as the days wore on, the tone shifted. The entries became less tactical and more personal, observations about the men, the terrain, the slow realization that they might not make it out. June 9th, 1944. Moved 5 miles northwest today. Encountered German foot patrol near crossroads. Engaged and eliminated 4 hostiles. Kowalski wounded, shrapnel in left arm. Not serious. We're ghosts here. No radio contact. No sign of other Allied units. The invasion must be making progress, but we're too far south to see it. Or maybe we're exactly where the invasion isn't. Hard to tell. Marsh's wound is infected. Need proper medical attention soon. June 10th, 1944. Found a destroyed American glider in a field. CG-4A, tail section ripped off. No survivors visible, but signs of a firefight. Spent brass everywhere, German and American. Collected dog tags from 3 bodies. We'll keep them until we reach friendly lines. If we reach friendly lines, Caruso is holding up well. The men trust him. That's important. Trust is the only thing holding us together now. June 11th, 1944. Heard artillery all day. Heavy stuff, sustained barrage from the north. That's got to be us, Allied forces pushing inland. We're trying to parallel the advance, stay in the wake of it. But the Germans are still here, still patrolling. We become experts at hiding. Hours spent in ditches, under brush, inside ruined buildings while enemy patrols pass within feet. I wonder if anyone is looking for us. I wonder if anyone even knows we're missing. The entries continued in this vein, a chronicle of small movements, near misses, and gradual attrition. Not from combat, but from exhaustion and infection and the cumulative weight of stress. The skirmishes. On June 12th, Stick 17's luck ran out. They were crossing a field at dusk when they walked into a German ambush. Later analysis suggests it wasn't an ambush specifically targeting them. They'd simply stumbled into the kill zone of a machine gun position set up to interdict exactly this kind of movement. The Germans opened fire with an MG-42, the weapon's distinctive sound, like tearing canvas at 1,000 yards per second, splitting the evening air. Private Nguyen died in the first burst, cut nearly in half by the high rate of fire. Private Kowalski went down clutching his leg, screaming. The rest of the squad scattered, diving for the nearest cover, returning fire blindly. Harkness, operating on training and instinct, identified the machine gun position, a fortified hedgerow corner 40 yards away, and began directing suppressive fire while Caruso and 2 others maneuvered to flank it. The firefight lasted 7 minutes. Caruso reached a position where he could lob a grenade behind the German position. The explosion silenced the MG-42. The Americans assaulted the position and found 3 German soldiers, 2 dead from the grenade, 1 wounded and unconscious. They took his weapon, his ammunition, and his medical kit. Then Caruso shot him. No one questioned it. Kowalski had a shattered femur. The bullet had hit bone and fragmented, tearing through muscle and artery. They applied a tourniquet, used the captured German medical supplies to stabilize him, but they all knew what it meant. He couldn't walk. They couldn't carry him 20 miles through enemy territory, and leaving him behind was a death sentence. Kowalski made the decision for them. Through gritted teeth, his face white with shock, he told Harkness to leave him with a rifle and ammunition. He'd slow them down. He'd wait here until either Allied forces arrived or Germans found him. Harkness refused at first, but Kowalski was insistent. Finally, Harkness agreed. They made him as comfortable as possible in a drainage ditch, covered him with foliage, left him a canteen, and all the morphine from the German medical kit. Kowalski's last words to them were darkly humorous. "Don't worry, Sarge. I'll tell them you tried." They never saw him again. No record exists of Raymond Kowalski after that evening. Whether he was captured, killed, or died from his wounds alone in that ditch is unknown. The squad was now down to 8 men. The breaking point. By June 14th, the physical and psychological toll had become critical. The men were emaciated, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost 20 or 30 pounds in just over a week. They were suffering from trench foot, dysentery, and the early stages of combat fatigue, what would later be called PTSD. They moved like automatons, responding to Harkness's orders, but showing little initiative or emotion. The notebook entries from his period are difficult to read. June 14, 1944. 3 men too sick to move effectively. Marsh's wound has turned septic, fever, delirium. Baker is showing signs of mental breakdown. Sits and stares for hours, doesn't respond to questions. The artillery sound are constant now, sometimes close enough that we feel the ground shake. We must be near the front lines. But which front? Are we behind German lines or behind ours? I don't know anymore. I don't know if it matters. June 15, 1944. Brennan deserted last night. Walked away from his watch position and never came back. Can't blame him. We're dead men walking. The only question is when. Found a crashed P-47 today. Pilot dead in the cockpit. Neck broken. American. One of ours. I wanted to cry but couldn't. Too tired to cry. On June 16th, they reached a small river. Probably the Tot, based on later map analysis. The river was swollen from rain, running fast and brown with sediment. They needed to cross it, but it was too deep and swift to wade. There was a stone bridge 200 yards upstream, but bridges were the most dangerous places in any war zone. Bridges were always watched, always defended. Harkness sent Caruso to scout the bridge. He returned with bad news. German checkpoint, at least 6 soldiers, possibly more in the buildings on the far side. Engaging them was suicide, but there was no other crossing point for miles in either direction. The decision was made to cross at night, downstream from the bridge, using whatever flotation they could improvise. They spent the afternoon preparing, cutting deadwood, lashing it together with parachute cord, waterproofing their weapons and ammunition as best they could. Private First Class Jacob Stern, who'd been a lifeguard before the war, would go first, towing a rope. The others would follow. The crossing began at 0200 hours on June 17th. Stern entered the water and immediately realized they'd underestimated the current. It swept him downstream, the rope playing out rapidly. He struggled to reach the far bank, his makeshift float barely keeping him above water. Halfway across, he lost his grip on the rope. It slipped through his hands, and he was gone, swallowed by darkness and current. They never recovered his body. The rope was lost. The crossing was impossible. They were trapped on the wrong side of the river. The final stand. What happened next can only be reconstructed from the physical evidence and the final entries in the notebook. On June 18th, the remaining 7 men of Stick 17 took shelter in a root cellar attached to an abandoned farmhouse approximately half a mile from the river. The cellar was stone-walled, partially underground, with a single entrance. It was defensible. It was also a tomb. The last dated entry in the notebook is June 19th. June 19th, 1944. German patrol passed within 50 yards this morning. They're searching every building now. It's only a matter of time before they find us. The men know it. We've discussed surrender, but decided against it. We've seen what happens to paratroopers who surrender, bodies left in ditches, signs of execution. If we're going to die, we'll die fighting. At least it will be quick. I've written down the names of everyone in the stick, living and dead. Maybe someone will find this someday. Maybe they'll know we were here. We did our duty. We just got lost. Below that, in a different hand, probably Caruso's, is a roster. S/SGT William Harkness, Kia. Vincent Caruso, Kia. PFC Douglas Brennan, missing. PFC Eugene Dalton, missing initial drop. CPL James Rourke, missing initial drop. Private Theodore Banks, missing initial drop. Mats, Kia. Private Raymond Kowalski, missing/WIA. Petka Tomas Nguyen, Kia. Petka Zuckelpten, Kia. Derao. PFC Gerald Baker, unknown. Private Chester Hughes, unknown. The final pages of the notebook contain no writing, only maps, hand-drawn sketches of their route, marked with X's where they'd encountered Germans, circles where they'd hidden, stars where they'd buried or left behind American dead. The aftermath. When Allied forces finally secured the area in late July 1944, they found a farmhouse and its root cellar. Inside were the remains of 5 American paratroopers and at least 7 German soldiers. The physical evidence suggested a sustained firefight, spent brass everywhere, grenade fragments, bullet holes in the stone walls. The Americans had fought until their ammunition was exhausted, then continued fighting with captured German weapons. One American, identified later through dental records as Vincent Caruso, had died with a German entrenching tool in his hands, his skull fractured by a rifle butt. The bodies were initially buried as unknowns in a local cemetery. It wasn't until 1946, when the farmer discovered the cache of personal effects in a notebook, that the War Department was able to positively identify the remains and piece together what had happened. Of the 12 men of Stick 17, 6 were eventually confirmed killed in action. 3 were classified as missing in action, presumed dead. 3, Brennan, Baker, and Hughes, were never accounted for. They remain missing to this day. The official investigation concluded that Stick 17 had been dropped far from their designated zone due to evasive action taken by their transport aircraft. They had conducted themselves with exemplary courage and discipline under impossible circumstances. They had engaged the enemy multiple times, inflicted casualties, gathered intelligence, and survived for nearly 2 weeks behind enemy lines without support or resupply. Their actions, while unknown at the time, had contributed to the overall confusion and disruption of German forces in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Staff Sergeant William Harkness was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. Corporal Vincent Caruso received the Bronze Star with V device. The others were awarded the Purple Heart. But medals are cold comfort to the dead and insufficient recognition for men who fought a private war that no one witnessed. Stick 17 became a footnote in the vast history of Operation Overlord, a single line in casualty reports, a brief mention in regimental histories. The men who comprise it are buried in various military cemeteries across Normandy, their headstones bearing names and dates, but no indication of the ordeal they endured. The forgotten. The story of Stick 17 is not unique. Across Normandy in the days following June 6th, dozens of similar dramas played out. Small groups of paratroopers lost, isolated, fighting private wars against an enemy who outnumbered them and knew the terrain. Some made it back to Allied lines. Some were captured. Some simply vanished, their fates unknown, their stories untold. The invasion succeeded. The war was won. But the cost included not just those who died in the great set-piece battles, but those who died in unnamed fields and forgotten cellars, whose final moments were witnessed only by the men who died beside them. The field notebook resides now in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It is not on public display. Researchers who request to view it are struck by the same details. The cramped handwriting growing progressively less steady as exhaustion set in. The mundane notes about ammunition and rations interspersed with observations about fear and loyalty. The final pages where the writing stops and only maps remain. There is a photograph taken in England in late May 1944, before the invasion. It shows 12 young men in jump gear, grinning at the camera with the false confidence of soldiers who believe they are immortal. In the back row, slightly out of focus, stands William Harkness. He is not smiling. Perhaps he knew something the others didn't. Perhaps he was simply tired. The photograph is labeled on the back in faded pencil. Stick 17, 502nd PIR. Good luck, boys. They would need more than luck. They would need to be remembered. And for decades, they were not. This account serves as that remembrance, a recognition that these men existed, that they fought, that they endured, and that they deserved better than to be erased from history by the fog of war and the incompleteness of military records. Stick 17, the Silent Battalion, lost in the chaos of the greatest invasion in military history, and found again only by accident, when a farmer clearing rubble discovered that beneath his feet lay not just bodies, but a story. A story of men who jumped into darkness and never found the light. A story of duty without witnesses, of courage without recognition, of sacrifice without ceremony. A story that, for the briefest moment before it is forgotten again, deserves to be told.